Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ed, very much for making this evening possible. And Jeff is right. The conversation, the thing about this subject is everybody wants to get in on it because everybody is interested in it and everybody cares. And there are a lot of good ideas. I hope tonight will be about good ideas and about solutions. Let me start off by asking the dumbest rhetorical question ever. Are you all here because you believe that fake news is a threat to our national unity and our democracy?
Yes. Yeah.
Is there anybody who doesn't believe that's the case?
Somebody has a bunny, I've heard.
So a few people not, but overall most. Well, I'll just add very quickly that whether, and we'll get into what is it and what isn't it, but some recent polls, recent CNN poll out and some others, is the majority of people basically everywhere today, not just the United States, but basically everywhere, are concerned and worried about fake news and worried about what they're seeing. Is it real or is it not real? Or it's a genuine concern. When that many people get worried about it, maybe there's a chance to do something, because you sort of need that. But I think there's more broad agreement on the problem, so I hope tonight we can focus a bit on solutions. And what we want to do here is we'll hear from as many voices as possible. I have a few remarks, then we'll have the panel discussion for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever is appropriate, and then open it up to everybody. And hopefully, in the spirit of a town hall, really hear from as many voices as possible, and ask questions and answers and make statements or whatever, because this involves all of us. To frame the discussion, I think, do you all have in front of you a 2-page essay?
Yes.
Okay, that's titled "Fake News in the Post-Truth Era and How to Fix It." This is a 2-page essay that was published in a journal called the Posse Press on October 19th. So it was one of the earlier articles on this subject. And so before we get into it, and I'm going to ask you to read it, just a word about the Posse Press. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Posse Press. Most people have not. But it is named for Posse because it was started by Benjamin Franklin in 1777 in the village of Posse, where I live, where its current publisher, I'll introduce in a minute, lives, and his office was just down the street from where we lived. As a journal, its mission, Franklin's mission, was to identify issues and advocate for public policies for the benefit of the American people, the American Revolution, the struggle against the British, etc., and for the public good. It wasn't partisan. The purpose was to deal with issues that affect all of us. Unfortunately, Ben couldn't be here tonight, but his successor is Nick Gardner. Nick, raise your hand or your cane, which is a prop in his case. Anyway, Nick Gardner is obviously an American, lives in Posse, and restarted the Posse Press several years ago as an online journal in exactly the same spirit as Franklin. There are 300 members, and we really sort of operate as a think tank about issues, write essays about it, and try to avoid partisanship as much as possible. The rules are very strict in the Posse Press that Nick has set for it. Essays are held to 1,000 words, which is 2 pages, which you have in front of you. And then once published, members write letters to the editor to add to the conversation, agree, disagree, or whatever. There's an old saying in my industry, which is advertising. Amazing that somebody's talking about fake news who's an ad man. It's rather bizarre. It takes one to know one or whatever, I don't know. But seriously, there's a saying that we have, which is forgive me for writing you a long letter. I did not have time to write you a short one. And there's great wisdom in this. It takes a lot more work and a lot more time to write a concise, short piece. And this one was no exception. It took quite a bit of time to write these 2 pages. When they went through many, many versions and drafts, it was vetted by a very rigorous and very talented editorial board, and a lot of input from Nick, etc. So I'm going to ask you to read it in a minute, but if you think it's good or bad, I can assure you, without the editorial board and Nick, it would have been worse. So it was a very, very good team effort. It took 6 weeks to write, but only takes about 2 to 3 minutes to read. So we're all on the same page, and to frame the discussion for tonight and give it context, I'd like you to read it. It tries to say, what's the issue? How did we get here? And what do we do about it? So take 2 to 3 minutes to read it, and then we'll start. Okay, you start? Okay, so there are 2 proposals in here for 2 specific reasons, which is that today our national unity is in pretty bad shape. We're very divided, and media technology and communications and how they have evolved has helped make those divisions deeper and harder to solve. So the thesis here is we have 2 problems. We have division in the country, and how do we bring it together better than it is today? And we have the issue of unchecked information, and that threatens our democracy from the Russians and from ourselves, mostly from ourselves. And therefore the 2 proposals are: one, a return to the fairness doctrine, which was operative until 1987, and which for the purposes of an informed electorate required the then days the television networks to provide fair and balanced news every night. And it didn't matter which network you looked at, you basically saw the same stuff, and people had the same information. And research shows that the electorate was better informed than it is today. We've moved on from then, we're into the cable television era, etc. So those are the proposals, and we'll move now to the next panelist here, and we'll discuss all these things and say yes, no, agree, attack, whatever, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, John.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'll get this going, and I'll start by just saying a few words. One, I'm going to say, I think when we look at the issue of fake news, to a certain extent, we almost may be dealing with a definitional view. What is fake news to you may not be fake news to the other person. And I'm going to throw out what is probably a provocative example. And I've picked it precisely for that reason. Scott Adams, who you may know as the creator of Dilbert, also writes a blog. He wrote, I think about a month ago now, that his choice of the piece of fake news that was most significant in 2017 was the characterization of President Trump's marks with respect to Charlottesville, as saying that there were fine people among the racist and the Jew haters demonstrating in Charlottesville, when actually what he meant to say was that there were actually some preservationists and conservationists there. You can disagree with it or not. I didn't put it out there to even argue the merits of it, but I did put it out there to say that a little bit of fake news is in the eye of the beholder. What is true for some person may not be true for another. I will also go back a little bit in history, just a couple of examples, which I stole from the Wall Street Journal, who a writer there was pointing out back in ancient Greece, the oligarchs referred to the Democrats as rabble-rousers and basically uncultured Slavs. Demosthenes, a Greek philosopher, complained about the oligarchs, saying that how can we work in a democracy when the questions are being framed which need to be debated, and the questions are being framed in a biased manner. So I would almost argue that the issues that we're facing right now are different. We're going to get into the mode and methods, how they are being dispersed are completely different as opposed to where they were in Greece. But again, I just go back 130 years now. In February 15th of 1898, the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. And then Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, you may have heard those names before, but remember the U.S., what was the expression? Remember the Maine, but then there was a, go to hell Spain. That it went together, and there was a bit of a rhyme to it. So it was, whatever happened to the Maine, was it blown up by the Spaniards in Havana Harbor or not, or was it an explosion in the engine room of the USS Maine? And I don't think it's ever been really established.
Could I just add, just on that, because I would do just a comment on that. At the time, we talk about post-truth too. There's a famous quote from William Randolph Hearst to William McKinley, President of the United States. He said, "You bring the army, and I'll get you the war." And then McKinley, in justifying the war, this was really about getting the Spaniards out of the colonial business worldwide, is what it really was about for ourselves, manifest destiny. But McKinley said to the American people, "We're also going to liberate the Philippines from the Spanish because we have a moral duty to Christianize our little brown brothers who have been Catholic for 300 years, but who's counting?" That's post-truth.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop almost immediately. But one thing I did want to go is we look at solutions to a problem which may or may not exist, and in what degree it exists, I think we have to be careful of going too far. I mean, we can easily go down the slope of Recep Erdogan's Turkey, where if you don't like a newspaper or a source of information, you shut it down. You don't like what somebody says or somebody writes, you stick them in jail. That's one way of dealing with it. I frankly don't think that's a good way of dealing with it, and I think we have to be very careful that our proposed solutions are not worse than the disease. Do we bring in an invasive, a new bug to eat up an invasive species and find that this new bug is taking over the country? In any event, let me...
Alicia? Great.
I'm going to start hazardously by disagreeing a little bit with Peter, because I don't think the problem is so well defined. And I've struggled myself to try to even figure out what people mean when they say fake news, because it seems like everyone has a slightly different definition of it. And as I went back and looked at how one might get at it, I asked myself, how is it different from propaganda, which is something that's been around for a long time, or some of the even earlier examples where governments have, and leaders and kings have all tried to manipulate public opinion. And I think one of the big distinctions and what makes this actually a much harder problem is that the technology has changed. And I think Ariane can talk a lot about what that does, because it amplifies each statement in a way that never could have happened before in the same way. If you look at the way Facebook or Twitter or any number of these social platforms, or even smaller ones within within a smaller community, that information gets propagated with enormous speed. And I was really struck. There was a really terrific piece in Science magazine early in March, and they did a study of something like 26,000, I think, Twitter statements and categorized them by false and true, and based on what various fact-checking organizations had determined. And they found that false information moved more quickly and was more likely to be forwarded, 10 times more likely than a true statement. So, or six. I thought it was just reading anyway, but maybe you can find it.
One of us, that's fake news.
Okay, that's right, one of us. Anyway, many times more, which is really sobering, because it means that it's such an enormous task to try to get people to be discerning, because it's just, there's something about statements that may not be, that are not true, that tend to fit into a whole variety of biases that we probably don't even know we have. And so we become agents of the fake news as well. So I just wanted to start out by thinking a little bit, and I hope people will talk a bit about how it is that fake news is maybe different from propaganda, what has changed. And I think the one other thing that seems to me to have changed is that it's not always clear what the intent is of the origin of the fake news. First of all, you don't usually know the origin, whereas with a government, you have a pretty good idea if you talk to people and who lived through the Soviet Union. They can tell you the government always lied. They expected the government to lie. It was part of the way people thought of what people figured they would do. But here, I think it's coming kind of more obliquely, and it tends to be cloaked, and so you don't really know how you might be being manipulated. And then the other thing is that increasingly, as issues get more and more complicated, I think we've lost shared criteria for judging what's true. And that's a very hard problem to repair. So.
Hi. Alyssa is right that there is a question of how this news gets distributed that turns the problem into something larger than is it true, is it incorrect, is it biased, because the impact is so large at the speed at which it can spread that even if it's sort of only slightly incorrect or misleading, the damage can be enormous. And I tend to think that not all fake news is created alike at all. And in fact, there's a lot of sort of, someone's provocative blog that turns into a much bigger thing because it can spread in manners that previously were not possible. And when you think about the kind of cost of entry into the publishing and broadcast market before the internet, when this was the manner in which you could address the masses, it meant very few people would be able to create content, bad content, good content, the whole lot of it. And I think that actually tended to make at least the mass media more likely to create good content, because ultimately good content has more value over time. You can resell a good piece from 60 Minutes. You cannot resell someone ranting and raving, sort of blog style, beyond a few clips that are provocative. And of course, you can create all kinds of good entertainment also in that way and sell it far and wide. So once you remove this high bar, this cost of entry, into creating and distributing content, sort of everyone becomes the media. I mean, this is the whole social media thing. Everyone's the media, and everyone is a vector in the distribution of the media. And where everyone is less than able to really create quality, truthful, correct content, when you speak in the same terms about your opinions and facts, which we all tend to do in the privacy of our homes. This is what it is. He is a terrible human, whatever. But when you are now putting it out there and multiplying multiplying the number of times that this piece will be read, you create a body of work that is at best low quality, but at worst, actually deeply problematic. And the thing about the science survey that said that 6 or 10 were that fake news is able to spread 6 to 10 times faster, it's usually because it's basically more shrill. The good headline is, Obama is a dirtbag, Trump is a monster, which is far better than, the very Timesian, I worked for the Times for 15 years, in speech, Trump talks about new plan, which I guarantee you is not a headline that can go very far, regardless of what's in it. So if I'm more likely to click on anything, it's going to be Trump is the best there is, not in speech, So.
Well, I'm not sure we still got the definition. I guess it's very, very complicated. But I would add a couple of things in terms of how this problem is being addressed today. We have had a migration from a news world where there was a fairly sharp division between reporting the news, objective truth, if you will, as seen by the reporters, and editorial opinion pages that were separated from it. With the advent of cable television and the fractionation of media, where we got lots of channels and lots of programs, we started to get into what a fellow named Tom Wheeler has called opinion-based journalism, where there's a bias so strong over all the reporting that it's hard to know where opinion is and where facts are. And examples of that are CNN on one side and Fox on the other side today. I submit, if you spend 1 week doing nothing but watching Fox, and then spend the next week watching nothing but CNN, you're not sure what planet you're on, because there are two different planets that you've gotten your news from. And that's what I see as doing more to foster and keep division, which I think is the biggest problem. Tom Wheeler was Obama's FCC chairman, and before that he was head of the Cable Television Association of the United States. So he was a major industry figure and then a major government figure on it. And he gave a speech in November, about 3 weeks after this paper was published, on basically a title called in Berlin to a major group. His title was "Has Technology Killed the Truth?" And it's a 40-minute talk. It was filmed. If you go on to YouTube, or you can go to the Passy Press supplement section and see it, because we posted it. It's very, very worth while listening to a man like him talk about this. But he made 2 points that I think are central. He said for him, news, the world of news and dissemination of news changed completely on June 1st, 1980. Which was the day CNN went live for the first time. And all of a sudden we had a 24-hour news cycle. We had news, we had non-news. We filled 24 hours. You can't have the same headlines every 10 minutes for 24 hours. It doesn't work that way. And so that was a big change in that respect. He also said, in regard to today's ability to target individual people and to send them misleading information and do all these things, he says the algorithms on the internet today and in non-internet media advertising is bought with algorithms, programmatic buying. You make a commercial with 250 different versions, and the computer will tell you what homes to send which version. That is what's happening today. It's called programmatic buying. Algorithms are running the world in that sense. And Wheeler says, you can't take a knife to a gunfight, so if you're going to solve this one, you need an ethics algorithm, or an algorithm that can stop the other algorithms or identify them as being fake or whatever. We haven't got our arms around this yet, but the principle of if technology is causing the problem, technology also has to be part of the solution. And I think that's very important. It is the divisions in the country, it is the opinion-based media that cement our divisions that is probably the biggest issue that has to do with this subject, in my mind. One man's opinion.
Okay. I'm going to switch tack a little here, and being the lawyer in the group, I'm just going to give we talked a little bit, do we do anything? And if we do anything, the natural inclination is to maybe take a legal approach to it. And historically, when you dealt with issues of saying something wrong or defamatory about somebody, the typical reaction was a lawsuit for defamation, either slander if it was written, or libel if slander was spoken, libel if it was written. And of course, the spoken was less important than the written. There's a well-known Latin expression, which I love, verba volant, scripta manet, the spoken word flies away, the written word remains, which has become almost meaningless now in the internet age, when the tubes, the videos stick around forever. But this was a bit of the historical background. Now we're also moving into the potential areas of dealing with fake news issues. I would argue, and many economists are actually arguing, that there's a potential for monopolization. We have the Facebook, the Googles, the Amazon. We have standard commerce, standard content, and standard what else. But anyhow, they have a tendency, or there's a perceived tendency, that they may be dominating the world, and maybe the answer is in more aggressive and more novel enforcement of antitrust and competition law issues. And then, of course, the standby, going back to what Peter said with the fairness doctrine, is regulatory. But how do you regulate? Is the fairness doctrine even constitutional in the United States? Would it stand up in front of the Supreme Court right now? I have serious doubts about that. So you try to address issues almost on an issue-by-issue basis. Sex trafficking on the internet, that is something that gets pretty strong bipartisan support to try to outlaw and make sure the content providers, the service providers, everybody will be held liable if that stuff shows up. Once you get past these very obvious sorts of issues, the potential for regulatory action gets a lot blurrier. And to give us some clarity on that, I'll leave it to my colleagues. Get out of there while I can.
It's certainly the topic of whether the Facebooks and Googles are monopolies is one that the press, once I came, certainly enjoy, because they look at the question of whether the distribution power that they used to enjoy, more so because of the inefficiencies of delivery systems, has been taken away. However, the question of discovery, which is very different than the question of monopoly, has to do with the algorithm, that there's no doubt about. And if you decide tomorrow we are going to split Facebook into a million pieces, nature hates the void, as they say, you will absolutely have other channels that will become slightly bigger, not to the point of being monopolies, and all of which will continue the work of distributing and allowing content to be found. The thing that will actually be worse, this is possibly controversial, some people might disagree, but algorithms get a lot better at checking themselves when they are bigger. You need a very large sample to optimize for certain things. It is also easier to detect what is wrong about it if you have very large samples. So if I split up Facebook into 1,000 million pieces, and now each individual blog is only able to distribute and allow content to be found within a much smaller network, whatever is awful about those little platforms will be a lot harder to try and fix for. And in many ways, Facebook has actually very high interest, not in policing from a legal perspective against this, they have an interest in policing against garbage because it makes Facebook worse. It's actually, to me, the most likely reason why Facebook would ever take action. Now, of course, if they get split up into a million pieces, this may be very moot, but turning the Facebook feed into a place of garbage, and by the way, they have recently changed the place that they give to news, to the great dismay of news publishers, but from about 5% of the news feed to 4% of the news feed. So the news industry is very affected by this at very different degrees, but the reason they did this, though they would never articulate it in this way, I suspect has to do with low quality content, and it's a lot easier to diminish the overall noise that news makes and therefore allow only the stuff that really has a lot more gravitas to rise when you've decided to give a lot more bandwidth to news content in general. And there is precedent for this action in a different space, which is what Google did about 10 years ago or so. They changed the algorithm to demote content farms. And so I don't know if you guys ever knew what content farms were. There were these really low quality sites, really, really optimized for SEO. So like it was like, how do I don't know, figure out what size shoe I am? And so these like articles were written, sometimes by robots, sometimes by really human, to have as many mentions of the word shoe and as many mention of buying shoes, shoe sizes, and it was, you know, real, it was very benign, but it was garbage. And because of the way that the Google algorithm worked, these pages were able to rise really, really high to the point where you could find maybe a couple on like the first 10 results that Google would bring back when you were asking this legitimate question, how do I figure out my shoe size? And Google demoted them and essentially killed their business because their incentive to exist was not the spreading of this low quality information, it was the advertising on the page and the ability of Google to send them a ton of traffic. So when they acted against content farms, of course the news industry was happy because it was not particularly targeted, so no one, you know, said anything about it. Now Facebook has a problem 10 years later where the fake news or the low quality news and the real news look much more alike. And so how do you try and make sort of the bad ones go away and kind of leaving in their space only the ones who are able to survive? And so if I take my news organization, we have about a total of 5 million fans, which is nothing to the New York Times, like, I don't know, 100 million or whatever, but there is a lot more engagement around this content that you have around low quality information, a lot more. So if you diminish the place of news in the feed, and again, we're talking about discovery, whereas the kind of low quality sites will see their reach drop by like 80, 90%, which is some of the stuff that you hear, my reach lowered in the single digits. So this gives me a lot more space. I mean, I don't like having lost these single digits, but I'm okay. And so, yeah.
That was fascinating. I didn't know any of those things, actually.
The arcane stuff.
I guess when I think about what needs to be done, first of all, I certainly don't feel like I know yet. I'm still confronting where I'm misled as a journalist all the time, and how to check myself and make sure that we have done our absolute best to be telling people what's true. But I really think that while there may be some legal solution, there is a really, really has to be done with great wariness of not amplifying the problem. The technological one that Ariane just mentioned, but also the whole question of freedom of speech. You know, my idea of what's fake or true is going to be different from your idea, and who is going to be the judge of which one goes too far down the, quote, fake news path. And so I tend to think that legislating has a lot of hazards and a lot of potential unintended consequences. At the same time, there may be certain things that can be legislated, and that is part of what has to be looked at, like perhaps some of the profit incentive for making money off of fake news or creating it in an intentional way as we've seen in the last year. But the other really crucial piece, I think, is teaching people kids from a very young age to think hard when they read. It sounds so simple, but it's really hard to do. I know there's something called the News Literacy Project, which is in a bunch of American public schools, trying to teach kids how do you decide whether or not something seems well reported, or how do you figure out what's true? And I think very few people stop and ask that question. We're all going too fast, so we go, so the dam's going to overflow, okay. And you don't really think about, well, is it even possible for the dam to overflow, or why is there a dam in the desert, or whatever it might be. And so I think that a whole line of education has to be made part of all of our sort of all of our growing up, so that we read differently. And with a bit more skepticism, but with some tools to figure out what might be right. And that goes to the next thing, which is that I think for people who are just reading every day, there needs to be some sort of portals, and there's several of them being set up now, where you could go and find there's a whole variety of fact-checking organizations, but I'm always hearing about a new one that I hadn't heard of that is supposed to be very, very good. Well, it might be, but I don't know about it. So how could I access and check some basic things by, could I look through like PolitiFact, is really good for politics, or there's sort of Ground Truth, which does a certain amount about what's going on around in the United States. There's, what would be those sites, and would there be a way you could get to them so you could keep them always there to check something? Now, a lot of people won't do that, and that's going to be a reality. I don't think you can completely defeat the desire for the quick story that plays to your biases. But you can at least give people the tools.
Thank you.
We'll open this up in 1 second, but since I'm the moderator, I'm going to get the last word here on something. I don't think we should try or ever will be able to decide legislatively what's the truth. I don't think you can do that. I think judges that say this is true or false is not what a democracy does. But you can legislate to require transparency and taking responsibility, accountability for what you said. And that is, I think, where, I'll give you an example. If you've seen any advertising for national campaigns, they end with, I'm Mitt Romney and I approve this message. The Federal Election Commission has required that any advertising for political candidates, no matter where it comes from, because a lot of it is from not the campaign itself, the candidate has to approve the message so that people know that came from me and I'm the one who's running for office. That's transparency in that sense, and I think we can go a lot further. And I think it's coming as it comes to Facebook and the internet and everything else. The issue is on fake news is the message may be, forget the message for a minute, but if you thought that message was coming from the Tea Party News, which you were watching, but the Tea Party News originated in St. Petersburg and not St. Petersburg, Florida, that is the problem. So the transparency has to be there. I would also add, as somebody who has spent his life creating messages designed to persuade people to buy commercial products, this stuff actually works. I mean, the reason this much money is spent on advertising, it's investment, is because the returns are pretty good. And the same is true for political speech. Commercial speech is far more checks and balances on commercial speech than there are on political speech. There's no control on political speech. And that's why the accountability becomes becomes so important. So I do think we're going to see legislation on that for sure. And I think in terms of the fairness doctrine or finding a way to get to a better informed electorate is really the challenge. Because today we have probably the worst informed electorate we've had in conscious memory. In the 2016 election, 60% of voters could not name the 3 branches of government. And 2/3 of voters could not have passed the citizenship test we give to applying immigrants with such terrible questions like who was the first president of the United States. And that's really, really, really worrisome. So on that note, we've talked enough. Let's open it up and hear from you. Okay, Madam? Thank you, very, very good. The business model is, can I make one comment?
Yeah, it's because there's something to reframe, but
The
go right ahead.
business model is very much a part of that. I couldn't agree more. I think actually, if you're Sheryl Sandberg or Zuckerberg, you're not sleeping very well at the moment, because they are in trouble, and what happens next we don't know. But there are national security issues here, and you heard it last night on some of the CNBC, one of the reporters saying, gosh, you know, we know people can do this kind of stuff, and that's fine. It's when they're selling toothpaste, but this is affecting our democracy, and I think that's a very important remark from that person as to where we are.
So the business model question is interesting because in fact, Facebook and Google have very similar business models, but do have very different products. And it's always very funny to me when I hear the French. I discovered a term moving back to France that I'd never heard before, GAFA, and I was like, what is that? And my colleagues were like, I was like, no, really, what is that? Google, Amazon, Facebook, very different companies. They're the bad ones. These are very different companies. The chief thing that one has to remember when thinking about Google is that their product is based on a response to a question you ask, whereas Facebook has a product that is just proposing things to you. And so it is not at all trying to meet the same need. My example of how do I figure out my shoe size, I've asked a question of Google. It cannot serve me fake news or even correct news about Trump. I did not ask for this. But in logging into Facebook, I am saying, hey, I'm bored. Connect me with the things that my friends have shared, friends or organizations I follow, or things that possibly haven't been sponsored. You know, that's the stuff that ties into the advertising model. By the way, that's where the model is the same for Google because they also do sell advertising, highly tailored advertising. But there is direction to Google and there is not direction to Facebook. The direction and what is proposed to me is basically a function of what I have elected to surround myself with. And only slightly on top of everything, so if I'm surrounded by crazies, I'm gonna get whatever crazy stuff they're reading. And it's going to sort of like bubble out, right? So I'm gonna share 100 crazy pieces, and one piece of that is going to make it all the way across the likes and the likes and the reshares and the reshares to someone perfectly normal who has no idea that I'm insane and I've started this one, you know, me and my other crazy friends. But so the business model of like, is it okay to allow these companies to sell highly targeted advertising? Because Google knows a ton of stuff. It's a question, but they actually have very similar business models.
Okay.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah,
I think what Peter was talking about is actually really important. I think knowing the transparency element of knowing where something is coming from has enormous impact on how you read it and regard it. I think if everyone had known that a disproportionate amount of material was coming from Russia, people would have viewed that information with perhaps a bit more skepticism. Probably not everybody, but at least some people. The same, by the same token, there were, these kids in Macedonia who were doing this all for profit. If you saw that something was from Macedonia that seemed to be speaking to what was going on in America, you might think, well, how did they know that? And so I think that transparency is actually a very powerful tool that doesn't necessarily impinge on free speech. And it doesn't even impinge on letting everything be accessible to people. It gives people one more tool with which to make judgments.
We're in an era right now where people are rejecting empirical truth for emotional belief in whatever they do. I mean, as an example, there continues to be a raging debate in our country on whether global warming is real or not. It's the only place on earth where that debate is occurring is in the United States. And not to get too political, but the Republicans own the responsibility for the destruction of Earth, as far as I'm concerned, if we don't do the things that we need to do. I mean, silly, but there is, over time, the truth always comes out in terms of what's real and what isn't. But you have facts and you don't have facts. An example. Trump says, and he bragged about it, that we're running a massive trade deficit with Canada. And he celebrated that kind of stuff, which drives you crazy. But anyway, he did that. When the reality is we're running a small surplus. Okay, that's a fact.
So what do you do about it?
And therefore, and that's where I think Wheeler and his algorithms, you have the counter, where in the media at least it say this was not real or whatever. But I don't know how else to do it. I really don't. My definition is it is the willful dissemination of misinformation for a particular partisan reason, not necessarily political.
Yeah, I would almost agree, but I would also agree with you that it's extremely hard to define, and I think it requires discernment on the part of the consumer. And as I was listening to the panel up here, I realized that, I'm a heavy consumer of internet information, but 90% of that is written, frankly, because probably almost an unconscious bias, I realize that people, when they put down something in writing, have to pay a bit more attention to it than when they say it just off the cuff, off while they're speaking. Alicia, do you want to?
I guess what is always difficult is that people can look at a set of facts or a particular source and they can say, well, of course they're going to say that because that's, they're looking at things from the East Coast, if it's the United States. Or of course, the government isn't going to want to admit that such and such failed. Or I'm trying to think of another one. The rumor about vaccines causing terrible illnesses. I mean, it's very easy for people to reject the facts. So are there facts? Of course there are, and that's part of my point about being able to begin to sort of create lists or ways that people could actually look and check facts for themselves if they want to bother to. I think a lot of people don't want to, and I certainly don't think you can. I don't think that everything that I might think is factual, others would feel the same certainty about.
Yeah, I think Alicia's right that there's a very large gray area, and it doesn't, your question, which is like, is there such a thing as exactly correct in the way that you would say 2 and 2 equals 4, like, please debate me endlessly that 2 and 2 equals 4. And on the other hand, a total untruth. There is no sun. Well, I mean, okay, but we've all seen it. But somewhere, someone can come in and say, light is, is an illusion. We've all agreed to call this thing the sun, but is it actually the sun? I mean, you can turn so many things that most human beings would take for granted and agree is a fact and reality. And you can find someone who will make some contextual argument for why this is not true and even so doubt about this. I mean, it's like, okay, well, if maybe it is not the sun, maybe it's a collective hysteria. So the question of punishment, which is, I guess, somewhat connected, like if we can all agree that something is false. I mean, let's agree then that maybe we're all wrong, but we at least all agree that something is false. What kind of punishment is there? And the framework for legislation is, of course, different from country to country. We were talking about in prior to this panel about how like Fox News in 2017 added before just underneath the name of every host for entertainment purposes only. Okay, yes, Google it. It's a real thing I found on HuffPo. Someone might, but I don't watch HuffPo.
Ariane,
And
maybe get some questions.
Sorry.
Some questions. Can we get some?
I'm gonna finish my sentence.
Of course.
And the women will agree. Based on can there be punishment? There can be also so many disclaimers that can truly protect you from the legal framework you could apply. And then of course you go elsewhere in the world, and that framework is not even there in the first place. So it becomes, but yeah, there is such a thing. So anyway.
Sir?
I can't answer that question.
No, I don't think anyone has, I think people have explicitly said repeatedly that it's not clear that there was any impact, measurable impact on the election. That's been said. I read it in one of our New York Times articles this afternoon. It's constantly being stated. The fact that they had the intention or made an effort, that seems more
Disturbing.
well, no, I was just gonna say that seems more established factually. But again, I think that's an important point. None of this would have, no fake news would have any staying power if Americans weren't divided. But it's a question of what exacerbates the divisions.
I mean, just to answer those two things, and I guess we're going to have to probably bring this to a close, but that's the whole point, for the sir in the back, that's the whole point about Americans are naturally divided today. Those divisions have been growing. There's cultural divide, there's the guns debate, there are all these various things. And the issue here is, the thesis is the media, fake news, however you want to call it, contributes to hardening views, because people who believe in that abortion is bad, okay, are constantly bombarded by what they watch, that they're right, and that adds to the division. As to the Russians, I thought when it first started, it was just a question of emails and stuff like that. But that's not anything near of what occurred. If through Facebook and other means, 137 million Americans got messages or originated in Russia designed to get them to vote a certain way, okay? Those were political messages. One that I saw that absolutely fascinates me, targeted to evangelical blue-collar Christians in states that were very much the flip states, okay? And you got Hillary is the devil, and Jesus is on Trump's side. Come on out and vote. Jesus needs you. Don't let the devil become president. That is not an American message. That was a Russian message. It's not, they created it, and that's what they do. And they're looking to divide every minute. Within 1 hour, within 1 hour of Parkland, the Russians had bots and trolls going to NRA supporters and gun control people to reinforce the division between, to make that debate even more dramatic. You're right, you're right, you're right, we should keep our guns, you're right, we shouldn't. That's coming from a foreign power, okay? And there seems to be little doubt of that anymore. So they were involved. Did they make the difference? Nobody knows that. Did they have some influence? I'll only give you judgment, having made well over 1,000 television commercials in my life. More than that. Well, I looked at what they did. Pretty damn good. Okay.
So I wouldn't be worried at all, actually, because Wikipedia is highly moderated, and so doesn't mean that some controversial stuff makes it. I mean, sure, but versus like all the other platforms, this one has more eyes on it, and so I would be less worried about Wikipedia than other places.
That guy back there had been
I
trying.
was just going to add one very quick thing. Wikipedia also has notes, if you ever look, so you can really see where their facts come from. And if they don't have notes on an article, they always say so. They say this needs more citations, and that's you can sort of make your decision about whether to believe it from there. So.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we really have to wrap it up now. There'll be little time to talk, but thank you all for coming and having this very spirited
Thank you.
discussion.